Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the continuation of the Vision Planning Growth and Environment Committee meeting. This is to conclude an item that we adjourned from on Monday. Just a quick reminder, put your phones on silent. 6 foot move buildings, health and safety requirements. If the sirens do go off, make your way quietly onto Third Avenue and wait for the staff to direct us from there. The item being discussed today is item 9.4. It's on page 43 of Monday's agenda. And Christine, Andy, Paul, and Ben will be speaking to this, and Christine's going to open us up. Christine.
So that's the team. I just was sitting here looking around at our team and adding it up. Probably between the 5 staff you've got in the room, you've got over 85 years of experience cumulative in terms of growth, planning, funding, development contributions. So probably quite unusual that there's such a stable team working in this space. And a number of us have been involved at a national level providing input. So there's quite a lot of knowledge to put into what I've said. So we're going to next slide. So we've okay. There we go. So we're going to cover these topic areas. We've got them sort of grouped in little batches. So if you're okay with it, we'll sort of work with each batch. At the end of each section, we've got a space for questions. So we'll sort of flow through. It's all a bit interlinked. We'll cover a couple of topic areas and then stop for a. If you have a burning question, pop in, but otherwise we should work through those sort of sequence. We're going to cover everything from what are the principles and how do overall growth funding work, where does revenue come from for growth, how do development contributions work, what are the nature of developer agreements and why do we do them, what's happening on the reform front, quite a lot of stuff happening there. A bit more in depth about feasibility. We've talked about that a little bit on the bus, but will be a bit more coverage. And then just there were some questions recently around growth OpEx, so just in a section around that. So I'll rattle through this front bit. Some of it we've sort of talked to you about a couple of times when we did the growth overview. Paul and I gave you a briefing way back in the part of the induction at the Regional Council building, and then we did cover some of it on the bus, but it just brings everything together, I suppose, if we start looking through the details. So we talked about the JINGA, the Integrated Growth Management, and we had that picture of all the bits of the JINGA and all the elements that go into this mix. So it is a complex beast, and land use infrastructure, funding and feasibility all need to be aligned to actually make it work together, and that's not easy to achieve. The underlying principle that we've always worked with is growth pays for growth to the fullest extent that we can achieve, and we'll talk through what is possible and what's not possible, and we'll also cover how much we haven't been able to collect and what we do with that. So we'll talk about that.
So when you say we've always done growth pays for growth, so that's like always.
We started with development contributions in the 1990s.
94,
but it wasn't full growth coverage. But
no, I was just going to say, so like this is going back before there was development contributions, so it was using financial contributions under the Resource Management Act. That's when we introduced those local development contribution charges, when those kind of big 5 urban growth areas were released in the 1990s. So Papamoa, Wakabayo, Haweri, Hyde Park, in Bethlehem. So it's got a history of going back sort of 30 years. And then progressively charges were introduced for the citywide assets, the big treatment plants and those things. So it's sort of started in the 90s and sort of ramped up since then.
Under the financial contributions, there was a lot more risk, and so council didn't fully collect. And then when development contributions came in through the legislative process, that's when there was more of a legal mechanism that allowed you to capture more, and so that's when it moved to more comprehensive. As you're aware from the work that you've already done, the balance sheet needs to cover the whole community. So it's about getting that balance right between financing growth and providing sufficient debt capacity to deliver on growth infrastructure, but also having enough debt capacity on your balance sheet to manage renewing and looking after what you've got, and then enhancing with the existing community. As you know, that's the big challenge that you've got. So we just don't have a balance sheet that we can only get to growth. We don't have the luxury of that. One of the challenges we have is aligning investment with the development and overall strategy. And we sort of learned through the GFC that at that time the council took a position, the last GFC, that we needed to really hone down on rates, and the community couldn't afford it because it was going through a fiscal crisis, and they stopped all the planning for growth. What tends to happen through the cycles that we've had over the last sort of 20 years, time was usually one of the later cities to slow down in terms of housing growth, and one of the fastest cities to start up again at the end of a recession. So we've sort of seen that happen a number of times. And what happened was, because the council of the day decided to pull back in expenditure, but it pulled back not only on the capital investment, but also the planning for growth, including infrastructure planning, that when the growth geared up, we weren't ready. We didn't have our plans, and we couldn't actually get on with putting infrastructure in place. So after that, it's a difficult time period. The principle that council always adopted is to carry on with the planning and have that ready in the drawer, so that when growth's going to happen, we're ready to go. Or, as has happened many times, Crown, the government of the day, puts funding packages in place. We're in a position to capitalise on those. Now, because of the fiscal tightness that we've had, we haven't been able to do that across everything. We'll talk a bit more about that when we come to the annual plan, that there are some areas where some of the funding for growth planning had to be curbed in terms of the total packages. So that's something that we'll talk about later on. Some of it's been included, but not all. Because we had insufficient balance sheet capacity, we've very much moved to a position where we're asking the developers, we're saying to the developers, we bring the infrastructure to the boundary, you have to do everything within the growth area. We don't have it. And they understand that, they've seen us as the position. And therefore we're entering into development agreements. They cover what the infrastructure needs to, what standards it needs to be, how we're going to manage that whole process. That's quite complex. And we're working through that and effectively setting up systems and processes together with developers to make that work. In terms of the development contributions, we only charge projects with a reasonably high confidence of delivering, because under the legislation, you can't, if you charge for something and you don't deliver it, you've got to repay it. It's a non-surrender process to do. There's some flexibility within sort of groups of assets, but things like something like the Waiari treatment plant, we don't actually start charging for that until we know we're actually going to build it, it's going to be delivered, because it's on such a scale that you can't sort of balance it off against other growth order assets. So we've sort of moved much more to that position because as councils change, they change their priorities, or time of investment changes, and then we've got the wrong calculation, or and we end up with under-collection. The other thing is that we need to do development feasibility to make sure that, given the charges that we charge, a developer can still make money, but they need to make money between 20 to 25% profit margins for them to be feasible. So they won't get investment capital from the banking institution without that level of projected return. And if the charges are too high, given all the other inputs, it won't work. And so the basic infrastructure costs too much. So we do a lot of things really nice. We'll talk about that. That's an underlying principle. It must be able to be delivered. We were caught in one growth area, which is relatively small, where it was too high, and the interest costs kept racking up. There were no development contributions coming in, and council made policy decisions to effectively cross-subsidise between rates to get that growth area away. So it's not something that we can afford as a council to do. So I think we're one of the few councils actually that does this level of work, but if there's about issues, we really need to go on. As you know, we need, it needs a lot of money. We've got restricted balance sheet capacity. The costs of infrastructure have rapidly risen through post-COVID. I don't know, Paul, do you want to talk to that? But what sort of expenditures we've been seeing, but marked changes?
I just briefly, they are significant. We've seen up to sort of 18% increases over that time period, just post-COVID, and supply chain interruption particularly impacting on that.
Planning for growth takes a long time. So the stuff that you see now from Tamar was zoned in the early 1990s. We've been working on Te Tumu for there on 15 years. the RMA and the challenges, we're now to the point where there's no really easy means for Parliament to develop anymore, and so it is time consuming. And I think the other thing is the standards and requirements that are in place now compared to the stuff that was developed in the 1990s is exponential in scale in terms of the complexity and things that we need to go through to get stuff built. So standards, and they're not, some of them are very sensible standards, things like the perfection and some of the stuff that's happened down in Christchurch and the roll through of that nationally. But others will question, and it's an ongoing conversation. We've done everything we can as a council to maximise funding opportunities externally. We'll give you an example of one in a minute of what we've done. But as you know, ongoing challenges and things like NZTA's funding assistance, they used to fund growth structure. They used to do a 51% subsidy, and we actually got, how many million it was? 30 million for the stuff that I think we did. It's about 30 million.
But it was a backlog one.
Yeah, there was, so we were treated differently for most of the councils, and so we effectively challenged NZTA that we're not being treated fairly. You're paying for growth everywhere else in the Whananga. So we did a catch up, and I think it was about $30 million, and we got it. And then subsequent to that, they've changed the policy nowhere in New Zealand. Now they effectively funding these growth corridors. That's a really yeah, trying to, because we've got the lack of debt capacity, using development contributions is really difficult, because you basically have to hold the debt until the development contribution comes in. And that's giving me having trouble actually delivering that infrastructure. That's not something that's time specific, but I think it is amplified on a complete other basis because we have such a high people at such a high growth level. And other agencies' positions are changing as well, and they're also being constrained in terms of how much infrastructure they can put in. And we need to have a line infrastructure across central government and local government. We'll talk a little bit more later on about the difference between citywide and local, but just to say that citywide is stuff that we deal with as a whole of network basis, and generally is an infrastructure capacity that's available no matter where you live in the city. So no matter where you live in the city, your wastewater will go to either, will end up to Mana. Your water pretty much comes from one of the three treatment plants. So they are citywide, whereas in your local street, you're the only one who uses that. So if you live at the Mount, you use that. Someone from Mount doesn't use it, and that's probably the easiest way to think about the difference between citywide and local. The active reserves network, so the large sports field, we treat as citywide, and we've got a session this afternoon on that. Your local neighbourhood parks, we treat as local because generally, most of the time, it's the locals who use it. You won't travel across the city to use that, but you might travel across the city to go and use Black Park. That's how it works. And as the city gets bigger and bigger, we need to keep thinking about proximity and how we provide an integrated network that's accessible to people. The government policy, we'll talk about that a bit more, is that we do provide for growth and we fund it. They are understanding that some of these challenges exist, but they're putting pressure on, so we'll cover that in that session. Going next. So we've probably got this here, but it's a really important point. There's a difference between funding and financing. So financing is effectively your debt. So I think about that as a mortgage. For your own house, you go to the bank and you get your mortgage and you buy the asset, and then you basically go and find a job somewhere and get some revenue in, and that's your funding to repay that debt. And it's effectively the same cost here, as that funding is the rate for the development contributions, and the financing of the debt is a sheet. So it's, those terminologies are important. So in terms of funding sources, you're probably aware of all of those, I won't go through them. And then the financing sources, it's obviously debt. There was housing infrastructure funds, you might not be aware of this. So this was something that was put in many years ago, and basically the government gave 10 years of interest-free debt. We managed to secure some of that for a couple of projects, the Waiau treatment plant and the Pimmoa interchange. So we get that interest-free debt from the Crown, we have to repay it from a repayment plan. So it just saves us the interest cost. And then obviously IFF, so those are the financing talks that are available.
But the HIF is still on the balance sheet.
Eight focus on the balance sheet, how much is left, Grace, that we've been paying it off?
I'm not actually sure off the top of my head, sorry.
Yeah, it was,
But there's 3 projects and about, there's Tamunga as well, and each was about 50 million, so we've maxed out 2 of them in the PI.
So it was a one-off, like,
the one-off,
right, okay.
and that's what happens, the government will put out a one-off, so they put out PIF, then they put out, shovel ready through COVID, then they put out IAF, and that's why I was sort of saying, we're ready to go, there's tends to be, now, the intention with city regional deals, my understanding is that those would then not continue to happen, and you use city and regional deals as your mechanism. But historically, there have been regularly, there's one-off opportunities, they change in terms of the terms and conditions, and we have to jump on holes to get it, but it's money that's available, that does provide subsidy.
Is it politicians trying to equip for these new schemes that pop up?
Yeah,
What is it?
and they know that basically the financing and funding model for growth is broken, and so they're trying to put some fixes in so that growth housing moves forward, and so they attempt to just create mechanisms. I mean, the COVID one was a bit different, was also trying to get people in employment and keep the economy going. But yeah, they tend to keep going up. So this is the case study we'll talk to you about a little bit a few times. So this is Tauriko West, so that's the enabling works. And so NZTA, we've got 87 million. That was a mix of state highway funding and subsidy share for the local bit. IFF, so infrastructure funding and financing, 10.9, so that's levy across the city. IAF, which is a grant non-repayable, so that's the gem in there, really, that 80 million. Developers, so the developer agreements, which are then split between the different landowners, 15, 10 and 50, 30. And then there is some development contributions that sits on our balance sheet. So of that 258 million, quite a bit of the risk is sitting with us, but the balance sheet is 19.4 plus the 60.8 until it comes in. All the rest is sitting off balance sheet, or if the cash comes in, we spend it, and then we can claim pretty quickly. So it doesn't sit on the balance sheet for long. So that was a really good deal. That took us probably the better part of a couple of years to negotiate, and that was a real shame that every time we just about got one piece of the puzzle in place, the other one fell out.
So the IF is guaranteed.
Guaranteed. There are certain conditions that we need to meet, so things like milestones, including like the plan change. But we currently don't see, on the track we're currently on, there's no reason to think we won't meet those requirements.
But the developers one is less certain, just for conditions, I guess.
Yeah.
There are some good conditions around things like the plan change being approved and for one developer, the project being feasible from the assessment. So we'll separately report some of that to you. And just quickly on this one, one of the biggest challenges of getting this funding stack in place is the cost of the enabling works rapidly changed over a sort of 3 or 4 year period. We were developing it. Initially, I think it was only the transport component. It started at around $50 million, $40 to $50 million based on our first estimate. The transport component of the 258 is now about $200 million, so that went up about 4 times what it initially was estimated at, and the other 50-60 million is the 3 waters component. So yeah, if we continually had to go and find new funding sources as that cost escalated.
So when this project's completed, we drag the asset onto the balance sheet.
No, only parts of it, because a lot of it is on state highway. So that's why, the mayor has been talking about the budget deficit.
Yeah.
Some of that is effectively, it's OPEX, because we're not going to own it, but it's a capital in nature. So it's one of those ones that we fund over a period of time, over multiple years, because it provides a long-term benefit. But from an accounting perspective, it's actually operational costs. So we only pick up the bits of the network of this that effectively become local. And we give most of its transport, and those rounded, they're on the state highways, they become owned by NZTA, not the council.
Understand. So my question essentially is, we haven't contributed a massive percentage of this.
No.
So when it shakes out, is the asset we take on gonna equate to that amount, or is it actually gonna be, is the asset gonna be worth more than we paid?
The asset on our books won't be, but the overall asset will be.
No, so I'm just talking about the councils, but
So we'll only get about 50 million, which will be the 3 water.
Yeah, and then there's got Fury have and a little bit, it's probably about a quarter of the 258.
yeah, but how much are we actually putting in?
It's 31%, 30% of that.
Well, we're not putting in anything because we, financing some of it, but we recoup all that money.
IFF we will, so
Oh,
IFF
and
will be the levy
And
that will
material
be charged to
charges,
the 10.9,
Yeah, so
will be to ratepayers.
we should get more than 10.9 with the asset back.
Yes,
Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely.
That's my question.
Yeah. Yeah, so in lots of things, it's a really good. Further consideration.
I think the other thing for us saying is like, next time trying to do this, it's probably gonna be even harder, because at the moment, you don't have anything floating around like the infrastructure acceleration fund. And without that, this deal, it probably wouldn't have got over the line.
And the NZTA tax, which is so far off, and before we get that either, so we wouldn't be a fish out of the field.
And I just, we talked about the accelerated cost of these things over COVID. And I know being in the industry at the time, I saw all that stuff happening. But I know for the fact in construction, that a lot of that stuff's been wound back a bit now. Are we seeing contracts coming in? It's not back the other way yet? Do you think it ever will?
we have seen some, but it's probably a little bit early to see, like, inflation's out at 2.2, so we will see some reduction in contract costs. So I think there's, potentially some more competition in that market at the moment as well.
Is the market still boiling, or is it come up?
Probably,
It's nothing to do with inflation, it's the amount of work.
I might just need to get some more information to bring back to you on that, but
They're just interesting.
Yeah, yeah.
We put pressure on them, can we drive the prices back the other way? But I know for a fact that there's a bit of profiteering taken off using COVID as an excuse.
There's an upcoming projects committee, and we're talking about James going to cover that, so that'd be a good.
that's on Monday, so we can bring that back as part of that. Yeah.
The stuff in the room, but.
I'll shut up.
Probably one of the things though is like we compete against, government projects, the same sort of resource. Government's got a huge program of road building upcoming, including local roads, like local state highways like DNL. So in terms of capacity in that sector, we're going to be pretty tight for a while, I would expect.
So,
Just quick, just to be clear, the increase from, 4 times increase in that transport component was a design change as well, wasn't it? It wasn't just cost escalation, wasn't it?
We did start with, I guess, a similar package of works right from the beginning. I think as design was further developed, like additional, issues were encountered that created costs that they probably weren't foreseen in the very early kind of conceptual design work. So it would have been a component of that.
So can I just go back, sorry, but just the question of rods is really important for our learning, I think, to say, we put that up, but to have an estimation of what's actually going on the balance sheet, sort of now and going forward would be really useful to have, to get the whole picture.
Can you just note that question down, because we'll just send it out in an email. We do know of that.
Yeah, sure, and it's just good for us.
Yeah. So this was a question that came up from somewhere along the line. You asked us specifically. Yeah. So in the LTP, there's about 800 million of growth capex and about 3.1 of non-growth. 356 million of DC revenue. So you can see the difference there between the timing of when you invest in growth and when the growth rolls out. And that's if you've got to put the infrastructure in a big lumps and the development over a longer period of time. So you can see that fourth bullet point says which areas are included. So basically what the council did through the LTP is it funded existing areas that were currently zoned, for which there wasn't enough infrastructure in place, that a landowner who was sitting in a zoned area couldn't build. So that infrastructure was prioritised. There was some intensification infrastructure prioritised that was the most important. And then there was planning for the other growth areas and land acquisition, so that we had static land and with the private land. That we didn't do all the planning, but a fair chunk of it. So what was pulled out was infrastructure in those next phase of growth areas. Predominantly Te Tumu, Keenan, a chunk of intensification CapEx predominantly through the Te Papa corridor, and then some of the longer term growth areas. So that came out. And overall, then we went back and said, because of that constraint, how many less houses will be able to be delivered because there's not enough infrastructure what that be. And we estimated about 640 less homes through the LTP period because the infrastructure wasn't there. So that was our estimate. And we estimated there would be an increase in intensification because there'd be less buy of land. And so the market would cut more intensification just because there's nothing else. Like there are feasibility issues, so there'll be a limit to that. But we will be net 640 now.
Just talking about that though, the number 640 doesn't seem very high, and that's because even if the infrastructure was in the LTP, it wouldn't be able to be delivered until the back end, and those growth areas wouldn't start until the back end of the LTP period, so probably the last 3 or 4 years. So if you included maybe the next 5 years of growth, like the 10 to 15 year period, that 640 number would be 1,000. It would be much higher anyway.
You've got that leader. Yeah. And that's the thing because the structure is so long leading.
Yeah, can you clarify, Christine, or the terminology here, like total growth CapEx in the LTP, like the LTP had 1.8 billion. The update from you, Paul, in our previous workshop was 2 billion. Now we're talking about 800 million. I'm just trying to see what growth component are we talking about here as opposed to the full sort of growth level of service renewals. But
Yeah, so this, and Fraser will correct me if I'm wrong, but the amount that's actually allocated into growth funding as opposed to the project, which if it's classified as a growth project may have other funding sources. That's correct. Yeah. So for example, if you've got a project that's funded 51% as DCs, it will be classified as a growth project for that total picture. But the actual amount of funding coming through from development contributions for growth will only be the 51%. There may be funding from renewals or something else as part of that.
So just to get clarified, you're saying that the $2 billion currently for growth, that's if you add up every percentage of every project that is related to growth.
That's right. If it's a predominant growth funding source. So if it's more than 50% of growth will go into a classified growth, but it won't have all the funding coming through from as a growth funding source.
So the 2 billion is actually not all for growth. That's actually, but because I was just the elements flipping it around the other way, there'd be level of service projects.
That's right. There's elements of level of service and so forth in those projects, yes. Yeah, but they're not predominantly that.
And it's problematic because the local government requires you to show growth projects and level service renewables, and you can't split a project by its funding sources. So that's what we end up with, that whole situation where you have to work off the predominant funding source.
I would think that'd be good to clarify that in annual reports and annual plans and so forth, because I think that is a tricky, because the difference between putting, 20% of the plan, 40% of the plan for growth and then only putting less than 20, it's quite significant. And I don't know if that's been made clear. I don't know if the council does have numbers with that.
We've got another slide coming up soon which shows you the amount of funded debt and how that changes over the LTP period. Exactly. So I think we'll come to that there.
So sorry, just on this, if you had a renewal project that was 75%, but growth 25%, that 25% is in the 800.
The 25% is in the 800, yes, because the actual growth funded portion will be, yeah.
So it's every growth,
Yes,
every growth portion of every bit of CapEx is in that 800.
correct. So I think in the next slide, I'm going to show the growth debt. It'll show the total growth debt, which is funded through growth funding mainstream. So, yeah.
And the reason why it's not a much bigger number is that principle that we're saying to the landowners, you have to pay for the infrastructure in there. And when you look at things like that 258 million of that, only a small portion relatively is on our balance sheet. So if we've got all those other mechanisms, we were asking others to take the balance sheet risk, not us. And if you were doing all of those DC funded, the level would be quite a lot higher. So this here shows you the growth funded, the growth debt and the rates and other user fees related debt over the period of the LTP.
Appreciate the uncertainty and relying on others to deliver more infrastructure for their subdivisions, but is that somehow captured in the OpEx later on in the subsequent, so we may lease those assets and
Yep.
it is.
Yeah, so we identify the legal best assets that's going to come through this is Fraser's area of expertise. And then the operation costs associated with those assets does flow in through the P&L.
Yeah, and on the previous conversation, those vested assets would also be shown as growth assets in our LTP.
So
It's another one where you'd have difference.
If we had a similar graph that showed vested assets, it would show it racking up quite quickly because that's coming in from those developers. Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Sorry, could we also be sent afterwards maybe for the updated version of this with the latest LTP figures, because this is the old numbers as far as I can see.
So we think. The latest LTP, but it won't be put copy on. But,
So you don't need to look at the numbers. So basically, what this is saying is for Tutumu, as an example. So for every growth area we retain, which is what the table is just showing you, is that we retain records of what's the level of debt. Every time a project relates to the area, it's accountable through effectively a reserve, a contribution to the reserve. We get development contributions in, then that gets credited to that reserve. Interest gets charged to the reserve if it's an overage, if it's a loan, or if it gets into surplus. Because of the time of the infrastructure, it gets interest accredited to it. And we keep tracking all the way through. So basically, that's just what that little table is showing you, that's all tracked. So for Tutumu at the moment, there's $27.5 billion of debt sitting on Tutumu. And at the end of the 10-year period, based on what's currently projected to be spent, will be $151 million of debt. The interest cost at the moment is being charged for a targeted rate for transport over 10 years. The water for the changes to water upcoming that hasn't all that's made. So there's a similar tracking for every single urban growth area and also for citywide tracks.
So Christine, this came out of the question when we did our sort of induction side thing around Tutumu, and I guess some of the financial risk associated with that. So even though we've excluded all the Tutumu specific investment from the LTP, there is a significant increase in Tutumu related debt because a number of projects are being delivered, like the Murray's Interchange or the Opal Drive pump station, to provide more existing growth areas like Papamoa and Wairaki, which have a share of funding to come out of Tutumu.
So in terms of that, which parts of these are put into the growth versus level service?
This
It's
is
all growth, even though
So those projects,
changes.
yeah, so those projects have a range of funding sources. They are predominantly growth funded. So I think like for the interchange as an example, it's funded at 90 or 95% by the Wairaki and Tutumu urban growth areas, and there's a small, it's like 5 or 10% allocation to the existing kind of Papamoa community, and there's also some NZTA funding. So there is again like a mix of funding, and that's similar for all of the projects. We've got all that information.
So every project will do analysis of benefits, which is what required under the Local Government Act to charge a development contribution. What's the area of benefit, and is it feasible to charge a development contribution? Some of them, the more complex ones, we get independent expert advice on them. We share that with the developers. We often work through a process with them, and if we have a disagreement, then that will get escalated to you. We work through that, and then it ends up with our contributions.
Just for clarity, to your question, like the transfers outline will reflect the debt related to growth. So it'd be the 8 related to the 800 effectively.
And so the 151 million will be a targeted rate.
No, so at the moment, the council's policy is that the interest on that money associated with transport will be a targeted rate, because we don't know the timing of determination, and the council was concerned that that interest will continue to stabilise and grow, and that's certainly for many years would create a risk in our balance sheet. So one of the reasons why they proceeded with the Papamoa interchange was the Papamoa community has for many years advocated and submitted to council to get on and deliver that interchange. So they said, yes, we'll proceed with it. And then they made the decision that the interest would be charged across the city, but with a high proportion of the interest going to the Papamoa Warwick area. The rest of it all sits there and gets capitalised. So the interest on waters gets capitalised into the 150 and grows at the current time. So if Tutumu for some reason were not to proceed, you'd have effectively $151 million of stranded debt that you would have to find a funding source for.
That targeted rate line, the 2021 transfers in will include the targeted rate.
But that 151 debt at the moment is 27.
Correct.
So we are going to be saying for the next 4 years, yes, we're happy that we're growing a debt of 151 million on our balance sheet that's got no opportunity of collecting.
Correct. Some of that relates to Papamoa's interchange, which, exactly. So you can make those decisions through subsequent EDP and LTP processes. Some of it relates to Papamoa's interchange, which is partly completed. So there's a projection of the share of the Papamoa's interchange cost that will go to Tutumu as a funding source. And that contract's been committed, but there are other projects.
Yeah, we can bring the list of those projects separately, and I guess the implications should you not proceed with those projects on, I guess, growth and other outcomes. And, Papamoa more broadly.
It comes back to the principles that were adopted. So the principles that sat behind it were, is there infrastructure that's needed for existing zoned areas? And some of that infrastructure provided for Wairakei, but also provided Tutumu benefit. So that's why it's sitting there, it's provided Tutumu benefit, which should be funded. Or is it planning money for infrastructure for Tutumu that's needed to prepare for planning for Tutumu? So there's quite a few $100 million extra that would have only been infrastructure only for Tutumu. That was all pulled out. So that was part of those lists of projects that came out of the LTP. They were all removed from the LTP, not invested. So they're calls that you can absolutely relook at, other than the ones that have already been committed.
Yeah, I mean,
Sorry, just that pumping station, is that is that needed without Tutumu?
Yes.
It is, so.
Yeah, so all of the assets that will make up the additional debt are required because of growth in Papamoa and Wairakei. And if you don't deliver those projects, that growth will be constrained or not able to happen. So predominantly it relates to investment in the wastewater network, so the Opal Drive pump station and some other trunk main projects, because the wastewater network in that part of the city is very heavily constrained at the moment in terms of capacity to accommodate any further housing, etc. And then there's a chunk of assets that relate to the development of the Wairakei Town Centre and the developer agreement we have in place with the developer of that town centre, where infrastructure is being future-proofed to provide for Tutumu. So they're building roads, they're building pipes at the moment, and we're saying this road needs to be a bit wider, this pipe needs to be a bit bigger, or can we put an extra pipe in here because we don't want to come and dig up the road later on, so we can bring all that information.
So we did that comprehensive review and pushed it out as much as we could that only related to Tutumu. But we've looked at it and relooked at.
So just for a curiosity question, given the fast track proposal that's now floating around in Wellington and Bell Road, is there enough capacity in the current pipe work if Bell Road gets a flip and how much of this funding cost can be added on to the Bell Road if Bell Road goes ahead? How much we keep all this?
Yeah, so I think the short answer in speaking with our waters planning team is that the Bell Road area would face very similar challenges to Tumu, in the sense that even with the investment that's planned over the LTP period, it won't provide capacity for that development. You'll have to invest in a similar scale of infrastructure that is required for Tumu, so significantly more. I think was it 250 million dollars of additional wastewater investment for Tumu is not in the LTP. So it's a large investment would be required.
And sorry, just on to Temu, what are you basing all, like the pump station and everything, what numbers are you basing?
Yeah, so that's comes back to our structure planning work, which is based on the full final build out of the Tumu of around about 6,500 dwellings, 15,000 people, and there's a big chunk of business land as well.
So because they're talking 8,000, does that mean that we don't have enough capacity?
No, so we've also looked at alternative growth scenarios, because like the future's uncertain, right? We're talking about a project that might not start for 10 or more years and will take probably at least 30 years to be fully developed. So we've also looked at scenarios of 20 and 25,000 people being delivered in there, and looked at how we would provide for that from an infrastructure capacity. So from a voting perspective, what would you do? And then particularly from a wastewater perspective. So there's a lot that can be done with additional storage at pump stations, and that, or also the move to low pressure sewer systems. So each sort of house has its own pump that reduces flows. So there are different solutions that would cater for higher levels of growth.
Then sorry, one more question. So assuming that Bell Road went ahead and was 2,500, that would effectively take away 2,500 from Temu if that was first.
Well, I guess the first question, if it was serviced by a TCC network, there would certainly be that issue of competition. I guess probably the benefit we have is that we haven't invested in that infrastructure at this point. So we've got probably the ability to go back and review design and stuff like that to say, well, if suddenly growth has gone from 6,000 now to another 2,000 to 8,000 or whatever it is, could we do anything different? So both would fit in. But those conversations are about to get underway with both the Bell Road fast track proposal and also the Kara Road proposal.
Thank you. Yes,
Bell Road proposal, north or south of the TEL?
It's on the southern side of the TEL.
Oh, so Western Bay.
It's in Western Bay. It's directly on the other side of where the Cameras interchange is being delivered.
And there's no plan or access via the TEL to that.
The access would be via the Cameras interchange. So it's been designed to enable an access leg into that side and also connection into Bell Road itself.
In terms of that issue, Tumu as well, up in Auckland, it's definitely not ideal. I'm being Warkworth where they are trucking sewage out. It's not ideal at all. But, 5 million people live in Dubai and they do that every day. I think they've got a desert where they spray it out. But what sort of growth could we enable into Tumu in the interim with some sort of creative, so best pejorative way of framing it, solutions there? Because I know, Andy, we talked about the 8-year lag in terms of getting the Tamunga connection there. Is there something we can do interim wise? It's not optimum, but places around New Zealand are doing it.
That's probably a question we need to ask the water planning team. I'm sure if that's acceptable, on what's acceptable.
Yeah, I was going circling back to some of the discussions earlier on, and it may be something for next team. Are we gold plating stuff now? Like you talked about in the 1990s, the requirements for infrastructure were different for subdivision. I look at Royal Palm, for example. How bad is that? What's moved on from there?
I'm not sure gold plating's for the right word. We have to work to the new standards that are set generally by the government or through processes like the development of our infrastructure development code. So certainly standards have increased because of a whole bunch of reasons, particularly safety reasons. If you talk about roads, public safety, because of environmental concerns, we managed stormwater runoff to a much higher quality. Because of flooding concerns, we now work to a 100-year flood event rather than a 20-year flood event. So all those are good things, but they do add significant amount of cost. A lot of the times our hands are tied. We don't get to control what those standards are, but we have to comply with them. So things have certainly changed, but we're not really going, I wouldn't have thought, generally much above what we are required to deliver on standards.
So is any of it discretionary? I suppose I use that term. To trim the costs or?
What we're doing, that's how you can make the corridor. Yeah, we're doing that to do.
Yeah, I mean, you'd have to look at it project by project, yeah, we've certainly in some of our work looked at where we've arrived at, in terms of what does best practice tell you what, say, the roading network with Inter should look like, it should operate. And we've looked at the cost of delivering that and the implications for the ability to deliver the development and said, gosh, that's expensive, probably too expensive. We need to go back to the drawing board. So there's a certainly a process in place, and we sort of just don't blindly move on going, this is what we should do. So let's just do it. We look at those broader implications. But that one's a bit of a work in progress, so we haven't landed on the outcome.
So move, it's the introductions of it. Yeah, so now we'll move into the exciting world of development contributions in detail. Anything on the sheet?
Yeah, so DC's has been within my part of the business here at PCC since I arrived in 2007, and I did a little bit on it Hamilton City before that, so a little bit of experience, for better or worse. I was heavily involved in the 2013 review of the Local Government Act DC provisions, and spent probably 4 or 5 years as convener of the nationwide local government contributions working group. So know a little bit about it. Fraser's been involved the whole time as well, and Ben since he's come on board. So I think you know a fair chunk about this, so I won't sort of dwell on some of these initial slides. But I guess the key thing is that firstly you can only take development contribution for CapEx, and that CapEx has to be related to growth, not your whole CapEx kind of profile. The LGA sets out a whole range of statutory provisions about how you need to establish a development contribution policy, what you need to consider, how you can allocate costs, how you calculate VCs. So it's important that we meet those statutory requirements, or else you can end up subject of judicial review, having to repay money, etc. And certainly that's happened over time. There was a significant case up at North Shore City Council some time ago. Obviously, it hasn't existed for a while, that council, in relation to the Northern Busway, where they did have to repay large amounts of funds. There's been a number of other judicial reviews since, including some recent ones at Hamilton City. But effectively, while DCs are complex, they're also simple. It's a simple mathematical exercise. You figure out your growth-related CapEx cost, and you divide that by how much road that infrastructure is going to serve, and you end up with that number. And that number is your DC charge. I mean, it's more complex than that. There's inflation to consider. There is the interest cost on debt to consider. So all those things sort of get added. It's about infrastructure you've already built. So for an urban growth area, you might have already delivered some infrastructure. A lot of that infrastructure in Papamoa was delivered over a long period of time, like 10, 20 years ago, but it's also about infrastructure you've still got to build. So in Papamoa, there's still projects that haven't been done, like the upgrade of the final section of the main road, which is partly DC funded. So that all goes into the mix of the development contribution charge for Papamoa. Typically, those older areas, the infrastructure is a lot cheaper and the DC charges are therefore a lot lower than new areas. We've got some slides on that. So you can't use a DC to fund renewal, to fund, I guess, catching up to where your level of service is set, or any sort of increase in level of service that you might choose to provide for. You can't use DCs for operational costs, for example, the funding of, you know, doing a plan change or a structure plan or something like that. But even where a project is clearly a growth related project, you still have to consider whether it's going to provide benefits to the wider community. And in a number of instances that might happen, for example, if you build a new library in a part of town where there's some existing houses and then some new ones, you'd need to consider that. And therefore, if you find there are broader benefits, you have to allocate costs through wider funding sources like rates. It can't entirely be DC funding. The projects have to be, I guess, either completed or they have to be sort of a new LTP, and that includes your 30-year infrastructure plan. So there has to be that clear kind of link and connection between your DC policy and your LTP. And I guess the big issue, as we've talked about with DCs, is that generally the infrastructure investment is kind of front loaded, but the growth takes decades to happen, 10, 20, 30 years. And so you've got this issue of having to cash flow the debt for a long period of time. So that's why we're having to move away from DCs. We do take an approach of trying to tailor our DC charges based on different types of development, because different types of development create different levels of demand for infrastructure. So a small house with not many people living in it versus a large house which generally has quite a few people living in it, get different charges to reflect the fact that, you know, they have different impacts on the road, on the water network. And we also have other categories of charges for different types of business activities. Basically, DCs apply to all development with some very, very limited exceptions. So there are some funds in place to, I guess, offset the DC charges for Kapakainga development and for community housing providers. And those have been provided for in the LTP, and they go through like an annual process where you have to apply to have your DC remitted, and that gets assessed, and it kind of depends on whether you meet the criteria, but also how much funding is asked for versus how much is allowed. So you may get all or only some of that back. And then the Crown is exempt from paying development contributions. So that's things like universities, hospitals, schools, etc. We were able previously to argue that through financial contributions, through designation processes, etc. We're actually quite successful on securing some contributions. We've won a quite substantive court case at the Environment Court on this, some probably 7 years ago or something like that. But the government quickly changed the legislation. So, we won the battle and lost the war on that one quite quickly. So there is, I guess that's one of the leakages we have from the DC system, that there's some developments that just can't charge.
Both the Kapakainga and community housing is a grant, and that has been funded by this revenue or funds from the sale of the other housing stock. So the council, they said that should be reinvested into housing and allocated money into a reserve effectively to fund those big.
So they'll certainly get their cake and eat it.
Or is it possible to shuffle those losses into the calculation at the beginning, or is it not allowed?
No, because the way it works is that you have to charge like each unit of demand equally. So if a development is creating a demand for infrastructure, but you can't charge it, you've still got to kind of account for it in the calculation.
So you can't exclude those dwellings from the divisor.
No, you can't. No. Well, you're not supposed to.
You're not, yeah.
And we don't. To be clear.
Yeah, so one of the things that we've been really careful of is actually trying to maintain the integrity of the policy and how we do it. and we've been really open and transparent with developers about how we apply everything. Getting a legal case is expensive, time consuming, and having to repay the nightmare. And we've got to a point now that the developers are really relatively comfortable with their development contribution. They know they pay their share, and they know that we're honest and fair in how we apply it, and that if they think we're not, that we're open to having that conversation. And so we are really careful that we stick with the law, and we don't end up in a position like some others have ended up unchallenged. I mean, it's always a risk, but that's a fundamental principle that we're here to the law and we're fair and transparent. And that's stood up well over the last sort of 2 years, really.
Yeah, I completely understand that, go along with that, but obviously any leakage and this calculation goes straight back to the ratepayer, which is not ideal.
That's not.
Yeah, so we'll talk about that some more when we talk about the, I guess, the broader fields that are happening at the moment. Hopefully that will address some of that. Just moving on to the next slide. This is around how our development contributions compare with, I guess, other councils. I guess historically we've been sort of near the top in terms of our DC charges. More recently, in areas like Hamilton or Auckland, where they're introducing these large new kind of greenfield catchments into their DC charges, they do have much higher charges than we have. So you'll see in some areas like Peacocks and Hamilton, Drury and Auckland charges in the realm of about $100,000 per lot. We don't have anything nearing that, but if we were to fund, say, Taraka West or Tumu, using a traditional approach to DCs, which we've already talked about we can't do, so all of the external infrastructure to the boundary, and then all of the key like bulk internal infrastructure, arterial roads, roads, that kind of stuff, we would be at the same level for sure, based on the feasibility work that we've done, be $100,000 or more per lot. And the work that was done by Climate Water for the Western Corridor SDP proposal definitely indicated that you're north of $100,000 per unit of infrastructure cost. So it's an eye-watering number, but it's pretty consistent with large-scale greenfield urban growth in other parts of New Zealand that costs are quite a bit of cost. So that kind of 100K level equates to probably around about 10% of the overall development cost. If you think about a new house and land package within a new greenfield area, probably around about $1 million. Again, very expensive, but it probably shows that PCRs or infrastructure costs are a significant component of development, but there are, you know, there's also some other components of development that are quite a lot larger than that. Just moving on to the next slide. This one's quite interesting. It shows this is historical over the last sort of 10 years around DC revenue, so actual revenue. The blue line is Taranaki City, the orange is Hamilton. So showing that generally we're at a similar or higher level of overall DC revenue as compared to Hamilton, which has got relatively similar level of growth, and therefore indicating that we take, you know, quite a strong approach around development contribution. The next two slides, and we're not going to go through this in detail, but it's just giving you an indication of what our development contributions are. So these are the citywide development contributions. So predominantly for water and wastewater. For wastewater, they cover just the treatment part. For water supply, they cover the treatment plants, particularly Waiari, which has been introduced into the citywide DC, and some of the trunk network down to the main kind of reservoirs that they off into various parts of the city.
So, sorry, can you just explain, like, Waiari, let's call it $100 million. How's that physically done? Is it that has a capacity to deliver 100,000 homes, so therefore it's $1,000 per lot, or is it?
Yeah, I mean those numbers aren't the right numbers.
Yeah,
that's how it.
But it's the capacity of that.
Yeah. And
plant, and you just divide that by the cost. And that's
correct, yeah. And the thing with Wairari, people go, well, like I'm on this side of the city, Wairari's way over there feeding Papamoa, why am I paying for it? But the Wairari treatment plant enabled, so at the moment the Joyce Road treatment plant is feeding into like most of the city, including the Mount Papamoa area. The Wairari treatment plant allows us to redirect the Joyce Road treatment to service the side of the city and growth in Tauriko. And therefore Wairari picks that up. So it very much is a network that all works together, and that's why it's treated as a city-wide, see, rather than more locally. So you can see here how we have,
Can I just clarify, just the mayor had raised a question for me, which is if it's, you know, well, I don't know if you know the number of blocks or whatever was said, but for Wairari, but whatever the number, are we saying you're future proofing the assets so that it could cover quite a lot of development in Tumu and effectively in the Western Corridor because of the Joyce? So does that mean if it's divided up by the total number of potential properties that can service? I mean, we're talking decades and decades into the future before that would be recouped. I thought there was actually a bit more of a nuanced approach to it where you try to get more of that funding back quicker rather than say divided by the potential capacity.
so we have broken it into stages. There's future stages of the Wairari treatment plant, which are yet to be built. So we're focusing at the moment on what has been delivered and how much growth it will provide for. We can provide some more detailed information post the meeting about.
So we won't, just to be clear, like we won't be covering through the debt, like, yeah, if there's a higher cost for the next stage of it, that will be factored in and that will be borne by the next load.
Yeah. Correct. So what we've done with Wairari treatment plant, we kind of waited until the project had been delivered before we started charging DCs, because what we've seen is, you know, if you start early, and then your project sort of doubles in cost or whatever, you end up having this massive under collection. So we sort of waited till it was finished. It did actually cost a lot more than was budgeted. And now we're starting collecting DCs for a period of time. And then as the next stage comes on, which is, you know, a good chunk period into the future, we will take a similar approach and then we'll charge that over the next stage of growth.
There are some parts of the investment that are providing for a longer, so some parts of the stage like filtration, etc., but other parts provided for a long period of time, and we are holding that debt to 10, 20, 30 years. So we try to break it down into stages as much as we can.
Just a quick question on that table there. The retirement village dollar per household versus the charge per unit, what's the difference there?
Yeah, so I was just going to explain through this table. So these are all the different activities we have. You can see how from a housing perspective, it's broken up into 4 types of housing based on how many bedrooms you're building. I'll come back to the retirement villages, and then for business activities, it's broken up by your standard business activity, which kind of covers retail, commercial, many industrial activities, and then your low demand business activity, which is more your storage and warehousing type industrial activity, and community organisations as well, so those sports clubs, social clubs. But for retirement villages, so retirement villages are typically built with a range of different type of housing. So you get like your kind of units for apartments, and then you get sort of like your managed care, hospital care kind of thing, which is generally done on a per bed basis. So the first one there, the charge per unit, is for the I guess, you know, villas and apartments and things like that, whereas the second one is the care component, which is, it's just calculated differently. Again, we can provide some more information on that separately. I've got that one right way around here.
Yeah, essentially the charge per unit of demand is much lower for the hospital care, for example. You get a much lower charge for community facilities, that type of thing, on the basis that if you're in 24-hour managed hospital care, you're probably not using a huge amount of those facilities.
So the very sensible one would be like your own unit, that's a separate thing where it's garden and that sort of stuff.
Then you pay a higher charge.
Yeah, and often, you know, you could be still two people living there. So moving on to the next slide, which is the local development contributions. So these are based around, I guess, generally the structure planning exercises that we undertake for each growth area. So you structure plan it, you determine all of the infrastructure you need to build. Then we go through the process of including that in the LTP and in the DC policy, through an exercise of, I guess, costing all of that infrastructure on a project by project basis. So relatively detailed that we compared to how some other councils approach it. And then those charges are all ring fenced to that particular urban growth area. In some areas, there's multiple like sub-catchments to reflect differences in how infrastructure is delivered. So in some parts of Waiaki, the developer was delivering sort of more of the infrastructure themselves, so they get a lower charge, whereas TCC had to come in and coordinate some of the infrastructure in Waiaki A and Waiaki C. So we had to deliver some big stormwater ponds for multiple landowners. So that got incorporated into the DC charges. We moved to a process for newer growth areas. You can see it for Tauriko, for Waiaki and West Bethlehem, of moving from per lot to per hectare. And that was for a couple of reasons. One, it was getting difficult to estimate how many lots were going to be developed in these growth areas because density continued to change. And then, but from a land area hectare basis, we kind of knew how much land was developable, so it was much simpler. It also created, I guess, a fixed charge per hectare or square metre of land, which means that if you do deliver more density, it sort of incentivizes that because you're not paying more local DCs. So this was all about trying to limit any under or particularly any over collection where densities were ramping up a lot faster than was previously thought. So that has been relatively successful and well kind of accepted by the development community.
I presume that runs the payment for too, doesn't it? Do they each other?
No, payments at the same time. So payments at the time that Vital was issued for subdivision.
So just on the growth portion of it, Keenan Road's been around for a while. We recently approved the extension to the Tauriko Business Estate. Does that development allow us to push the business road development closer to the Upper Belt Road residential, so potentially could lower the cost for the residential road? Or does it make that development slightly more attractive now that the business development's moving closer?
Yes, so
it's Keenan Road, because Keenan Road's got a fairly chunky development cost to it until it gets harder.
yeah, so it won't help a lot with Keenan Road. Some of the infrastructure we talked about, which was excluded from the LTP, is all pretty Keenan Road specific. But we are going to be looking to introduce some new DC catchments in the upcoming DC policy review. So there will be a Tauriko kind of stage 4 for the business estate. We'll introduce Tauriko West catchment and also one for Upper Otauri, for areas that have been rezoned. But in your point there, Martin, in stage 4 of the business estate, which adjoins the Upper Belt Road area, there is a need to think about future proofing for Upper Belt Road. There is only one access up here at the moment. So we've already worked through that and agreed with the developer the fact that they need the road to be this wide, but we actually need a corridor that's this wide. We need there to be provision for various additional pipes and stuff to be able to be put in either initially or later. And there's some money set aside in the LTP, particularly for the additional width that's required in the land acquisition component.
Yeah, Andy, can you just clarify the way the citywide DCs are incorporated for the people who pay the local DCs? In other words, if Waiari comes on stream and benefits people across the city, that's through when you know, cut the section in half, sell off something, then that's sorted. For the people who are in, for instance, Wairaki, how that works there, for the people who are in potentially Hyde Park, Bethlehem West, where it's all like they might have already paid their DC.
So there's no overlap between the local and the citywide DCs. They are paying for different infrastructure. So you pay both, right? But generally the person is, and it does come on to the next set of slides and the questions that were previously asked through the vision committee meeting. But the person that's paying those DCs is normally different. Normally, the land developer, person in subdivision, pays your local DC charges, and then when someone buys a section and comes to build a house, they pay the citywide DC charge. So there's no overlap. That's very important as a key part of the legislation. There's no double dipping, so you can't kind of charge twice. Can't charge a DC and you can't charge another type of DC or another funding source to fund the same thing. So you know, put in twice the amount of what the infrastructure can charge. Does that answer your question?
And sorry, just that water, like looking at the local, you know, the water charge. So is that a reflection of, you know, like how far the pipes have to be built to get there and, you know, how hard it is? Like I'm just saying, like, you know, Ohauiti is a lot more than Bethlehem. Is that just because it's?
Yeah, there's a range of factors in terms of probably a key one is when you build the infrastructure. So like some of those older areas, it was cheap to deliver the infrastructure. Some of the newer areas more expensive. In the case of Ohauiti, it needs some specific like reservoirs and stuff to be built. So just in terms of just making sure you understand the split. So while you have a citywide, for example, water charge and a local water charge, the citywide piece, as I mentioned before, treatment plant, trunk mains down to your big reservoirs, like the ones you see in Bethlehem, for instance. And then your local water charge is for the trunk pipes from the reservoir to the growth area and within the growth area. So typically anything that's like of a size of 150 or 200 millimeters or larger, and the smaller pipes are there delivered within the subdivision at the developer's cost and lease of the council. All right, so maybe on.
Sorry, Andy, just going back to the local contribution and the per hectare charge to you know, obviously incentivize the yield to the number of houses. And when you then look at the citywide charge on each of those dwellings, does that potentially get a better income given there are more citywide charges, or was that largely lost through the smaller like 1 and 2 bedrooms compared to a 3 bed which get on a larger lot? Or how does that work? Does that result in a better?
Yeah, so overall the idea of DCs is we've got X amount of infrastructure cost and we calculate to ensure that the charges are set so that we will collect that full cost back. So we make all the adjustments required to say we're going to get X amount of 1 bedroom homes that they'll pay less, but 4 bedrooms will pay more, just to equate that out. So it doesn't affect your overall income. Obviously it does if we get those assumptions wrong, but we do our best to make sure we get them right and review them. That sort of thing.
So how does Hamilton work out in terms of the demand of the infrastructure, given they don't have a citywide?
Get onto that. This covered in our next set of slides. So this comes from the questions that you asked a few months ago, which was around, I guess, that current approach we have of splitting the charges into partly subdivision, which is your locals, and partly at building consent being your citywide. And what ability there would be to bring it back so that we were charging it all at subdivision stage, and what impacts would that have on various different parties, including land developers. And there was a resolution passed that a report would be brought back to you in early 2025 once we knew the outcome of the review of the development contributions legislation, which is underway and that might happen. So I've got a few slides covering these issues. But just, well, we've already talked about the background that this approach has been in place for a long time, well before I came here. So it was sort of like pick up and run with what we've got. It has been questioned quite a number of times. It's pretty regular, even the issue comes up. And obviously there's going to be winners and losers out of it compared to like those that pay at the moment versus those that would have to pay more or less or not at all as a result of making changes. So the next few slides cover off some of the key considerations. Just move to the next one. So the first one is around water reform. Now the majority, I think about 80% of the citywide development contributions, that's on the slide there, $27,000 out of 34 or something like that, is for your water and wastewater citywide DC charges. If that moves out of, I guess, council activity, becomes an activity in a new entity that is established, there will be a new way of funding for that entity. There won't be development contributions. There might be something similar, but they will have to consider how they want to fund their growth-related water assets. And so that's a critical thing to find out what's going to happen with water reform. What does it mean for funding in terms of whether or not it makes sense to review what we're doing at the moment.
The other thing is that the debt that's currently on our balance sheet that relates to workers would transfer to the new entity, so they would take down the outstanding.
And what's the legislation at the moment? Because like Watercare, they charge you a connection charge. And does that have to, is that a better way because they can just charge what they like, or do they have to justify it again by this many people?
So theirs is a lot looser than using a development contribution. They do an infrastructure growth charge, which is the equivalent of a development contribution. It's more an average across kind of the whole city rather than targeted like we have to different parts of the city. They've got more scope to adjust that. Theirs is a contractual model though. It doesn't have the backing of this, the legislation.
So you don't have to justify the charge as much in that situation.
Yeah, to a point. Yeah. That's right. So the second key issue around if we were to sort of change things and effectively do away with the citywide DC and bring it into the local DC charges, the transition process, that would be pretty complicated because in the city you're going to have a whole bunch of vacant sections which haven't yet been built on. So you're going to have to continue to charge them the citywide DC, or else you're going to lose a lot of revenue when they get developed. Then you're going to have subdivisions that are already underway, which there is some, and they may be in various different stages. Some consents might be granted already, others might be in construction, etc. So you'll have to deal with those. And then you'll likely get a huge flurry of consents, subdivision consents coming in before you make this change because developers will want to avoid having to pay the additional citywide DC. And those consents often are very large. For example, when the lakes, when Caris became the developer of the lakes, they consented their whole subdivision, like 1,000 lots. And so you're likely to have things like that happen. And therefore, this very long transition of 5 to 10 years of development happening, you just sort of manage through kind of regimes. So that's just something that would need to be worked through. It's not impossible, but it would have quite an administrative kind of burden within the organisation. And then you've got the issue, the third one on there, that of around the difficulty of targeting, and this comes to your question, Rick, the various development type at the subdivision stage. So when someone subdivides off a section, residential section, you don't know if someone's going to build a big house or a little house or a medium-sized house or whatever. And therefore it makes it more difficult much more difficult to apply that kind of targeted charging approach that we've got of charging a big house more than a small house. Just generally don't know. The way that Hamilton deal with this is I'm saying, jump in if I miss something, but they sort of take a general approach that we think it's on average going to be like a 3-bedroom house. If it ends up being larger, they'll charge the difference. If it ends up being smaller, I understand their approach was that, well, sorry, kind of bad luck, we'll just leave that. That's right, and yeah.
Sounds like a break.
Yeah, it won't be without challenge.
Yeah, could that be a solution that you basically say, you know, it's a 1-bedroom, we're charging at consent, we're charging you a 1-bedroom home, and anything over that is done at building consent.
You could definitely do something like that. Obviously, again, it's at an administrative, like then you're going to have to go look at every kind of consent again. But it's still doable and achievable.
Well, it's pretty simple in my mind. If the local development fees have been paid, then you just charge at building consent, and if they haven't, then it switches to the new model and then just pay the difference of building consent. But
that's right, but you got to also remember that there'll be a significant time lag, and so your DC charges will have changed, and you get all these kind of issues that we have with I guess some customers that like to query it's a bit really clear data. Yeah.
I think the other thing is because the subdivision is way earlier than the building consent, then we review our policy every year and update it for actual costs. If the costs are rising, you've already charged, you can't effectively go and get a shortfall. So the benefit of living them is that you've got more current costs in your calculations. So it could be
Can we
years between
change
subdivision.
that from consent to like issue of title? Like there's like you get your consent, there's no reason to get going. Whereas, you know, if you said it's that issue of title and that's just a lottery, so.
No, so the way things work is under the LGA is that your DC charge is locked in at the time you lodge your resource consent application, and that charge will sit with you over the life of your development, even if it takes you sort of 5 or 10 years to complete your subdivision. So that's one of the issues that we've raised through the review of the DC legislation. So there may or may not be some movement, and we're expecting some cabinet decisions. So we should have a good idea in the next couple of days. I guess that's an example of just how the kind of legislation sort of, it's kind of leans against council being able to recover the full cost of the road. So just moving to the next slide, and I guess one of the key reasons about why you might look to make a change is around what this might do to the overall cost of housing. And will it reduce, housing costs for the community? Or those building new houses. It's certainly not going to change the overall development contribution and infrastructure costs. That is going to remain the same, just when that is paid. But I guess, there's different schools of thought on what it might mean for development costs and housing costs. Because land developers are going to be faced with higher costs for their development, they may consider that and go, well, I'm only now willing to pay this for the land that I buy to develop. But it's a lot of developers already own that land and have already kind of got a locked in kind of price. So that might only, if that kind of approach actually happen, it might take a long time for that to feed through, because some of these growth areas are already controlled by developers that haven't even started development yet and will take 10 to 20 years to develop, like Turriga West or Determined. But it may also be that builders might go, well, I'm faced with lower costs now, so I can buy sections a little bit cheaper, and now I can, and just offset that through being able to charge more for that house building component, knowing that housing prices are set at a market level. So there's a lot of uncertainty around those issues. It's probably not entirely clear. Just moving on to the next slide, which is the last one in this section. And this is around the specific question that was asked around would land developers have that financial capacity to pay the citywide actually at that subdivision stage. What we know with our greenfield kind of feasibility work from areas like Taupo West and Tutumu is that those is really finely balanced that feasibility, and throwing more costs at it is certainly not going to make it easier for these projects to be delivered. And we're still working through some stuff with Tauriko West and the developer funding around feasibility before that becomes unconditional. I would expect that we'll get a lot of pushback from that development community and concern about some of the projects that they have ongoing. And like I say, a lot will probably depend longer term on whether they can source land at a lower cost that sort of offset any additional. Otherwise, it just gets pushed into, it becomes a cost of production effectively, and it has to be recovered through higher section prices. So I'll sit there for discussion.
Yeah, I really, I understand what you're saying, and it would be a hard transition, but that's exactly what we need to try to achieve, is that developers can't afford to pay the prices that they're paying for land. This is that, because, we're just getting landowners winning that are walking away winning the lottery without contributing to any infrastructure. And the cost of our land is so expensive is because the developers can afford to do it and be feasible. So we need to sort of set that somehow going forward that actually it's not going to be cheap to develop. So you can't pay those astronomical prices. And that's effectively, I guess, when they talk about the value capture, basically, that the value capture is effectively not there because the developers can't pay those big prices, and the landowners are winning really. So I guess that's really the challenge, I'd say, for us, is how do we get there, that we actually stop those landowners winning big, and that those big that money then goes into effectively paying for the infrastructure. That's the challenge.
Does this become a mechanism where we can actually almost force people back into intensification? And
Not at the moment.
no, but if we made changes where it does actually make it more expensive for the developers to do greenfield stuff, would that not push them back into?
Yeah, to a point, I guess, whether it would completely is offsetting the loss of greenfield development, probably not quite to that extent. Yeah.
Done quite a lot of work on feasibility of intensification. If that's something you wanted us to bring back to us at meeting, we can do that.
We've got that. Yeah.
I guess that comes back to that conversation, right? And what I've been talking about, we need to get these 50, 100-year costings. And obviously under the legislation, it doesn't allow us to do that now, but that we can actually say those sections in Tauriko or those sections in Te Tima are actually costing us this amount, and a high rise in the CBD is costing us this amount. So therefore that's $15,000 and that's $250,000. Work that into your calculations. Does it still work? That's ultimately, as a city, if we're going to get to a place that we are truly growth based for growth, is we've got to actually start costing these things. And I understand under the legislation right now we can't do that, but that's got to become like a development levy, not a development contribution. But
we're not in a bubble though, are we too? So the other thing is that a lot of these big developers work right around the country. So I suppose how we work and how we've got to make sure that we don't make an environment that they just go, we're reducing our business in Tauranga. We can't work in, because every place in the country wants to grow. So we've got to make sure that we're competitive and attractive for you know, a lot of our builders have got, you know, and are looking at the moment to expand their development in other parts of the country. So we've got a, yeah, it's a bit of a balance.
So it's us controlling where we want to see development.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Because they'll
We've also got to facilitate.
Well, yeah, but they'll come and build in the CBD because suddenly that makes much more financial sense than building out there. It's just,
Yeah, maybe, or else they'll say, you know, you go over 3 stories, it's not, you know, we've heard some feedback from them already on what's feasible or not. The other ones that are on the ground.
yeah, but if you take, that's what I mean, you take the development contributions down to 15K,
Yeah.
probably changes the game for them.
Yeah, but that would be more of a discount rather than an add-on. Otherwise we'll lose. So you've got to balance out somewhere.
Well, I think the market controls where the price of land going, because it's all based on the ability of people to pay for the roof over their head. Whether that, you know, it's so much per week, for example, whether that's a rent or mortgage, that sets the price, the house land package price for that development. So the developers, even the land development, people will be building houses, but if you go back to the land development, when they do the calculation of what they are paying or willing to pay for that raw land, they do all the calculations and include actually what the city wide fees are as well in that calculation, as well as the local contribution, because they're always looking at that house land package. I used to be, you know, keen on bringing all that to the local government. But when, you know, thinking about it more, you know, the TCCs are it's well refined, it's accepted, the developers know what they're talking about, or know what they're up for. To potentially change it now, it's taking high risk, you know, we've got the, as Christian said, a lot of the land ownership is already in place, so purchase the raw land, the sale of the farm, and it's going to have a huge cash flow implication. But if you come back to the point that it's all factored in anyway, the net result wouldn't be much different, but you put in place that risk through development by changing the regime, and I'd highly discourage it. Particularly for me, you were, you know, really keen to bring that forward into the local charge at an earlier time.
I'm surprised.
Why, you know, it's, we've got to face.
And it wasn't recorded, I think it's disappointing. Wasn't recorded either, I propose it.
So just completing this, you know, we'll work towards that resolution and bringing a report back. As we say, there's a couple of key things that probably will influence whether it's worthwhile moving forward with this. One is around water reform, because most of the citywide DC charge is for the 2 waters. And one is what happens with the broader DC legislative reform. I guess that's, as you've said, the inputs of for other understanding better the development community kind of impacts, both the, you know, the builders but the land developers will be critical. So we'll probably look to do some engagement through the property developers group to bring informed paper to you when we bring that. But just a point around land costs, and this comes up later in the slide around development feasibility, is that when you look at the cost structure of delivering a subdivision, your raw land costs, so what you buy the land at from the farmer or the orchardist or whoever, generally makes up less than 10% of the cost of subdivision. So even if you're going to change that, you're not going to have a large impact on what your section price is at the end of the day. And we'll work through where the big cost kind of component of subdivision is later into those slides. But we're going to turn over now to Paul, who's going to talk about the DC under collection.
Thanks, Andy. So just in terms of under collection, I think the first point to put out is through this, the earlier slide you saw on the reserve calculations does give us the ability to calculate the backlog quite accurately as to what it is at any point in time. As far as we're aware, we're the only council that we know that actually does that, which is good and it's bad. But we do actually know what the amount is. Three key reasons, and we've touched on some of these already, but three key reasons are project costs increasing after we've started collection, so you can't go back and recharge, obviously. Changes in the actual growth pattern, and again on that timing issue, just in terms of locking the DC charges in at the time of consent allocation. And just the last point there is just obviously because we've still got different point, sorry. So just in terms of under collection, we are moving to more development agreements just to reduce that risk going forward. So just important to note that. In terms of what the under collection actually looks like, so we've collected just under $500 million. Our under collection is 76 million, and we've transferred to date around 30 million to ratepayer funded debt. I'll come to that on the next slide about how that process works. In terms of citywide DCs and local catchments, if there are significant growth, obviously we don't transfer any of that. What that means is that there is still some risk around that number increasing in the future as those catchments fill up, and if some of those three factors come to play, there can be further increase in that moving forward. What the backlog looks like, so there's 46.9 million remaining, so that's effectively the 30 million that's being transferred across to ratepayer funded, and this is the remainder that's left across the various areas. And then the next slide just goes through how we transfer that. So each long-term plan, it's an update to the amount of the under collection, and then there's a report that goes to council effectively that allocates the amount that's transferred to ratepayer funded debt over a period of time. Probably the big change that happened in the last long-term plan was normally this has been transferred across to general rate funded debt. In the last long-term plan, there was a decision made for a targeted rate around Pies Par West instead of increasing the general amount to a higher amount. So that has meant that it's slightly lower on the general rate, but there is a targeted rate for that transfer now in place. Questions?
What's the citywide DCs? What's the under collection? How does that work? Do you have under collection there?
We haven't calculated that because the difficulty with the local DCs, there's a start point and an end.
Yeah.
There isn't with the citywide. So at this stage, and that's why we noted as one of the risks, we haven't actually calculated a backlog for the citywides because they kind of overlap. And in actual fact, we can change the length of time that we collected over. So if we suspected there was a shortfall because we hadn't had the growth as fast and that sort of stuff, we could extend the length of time we were collecting. That's for particular projects for. So there are also other ways of mitigating that backlog risk for citywides.
But when you look at the raw numbers as opposed to the percentage of each local DC, then the sheer quantum of the citywide is like there's only, I think, Pies Par West from memory, which has got a significant, I think it's 40s, 46 or something, for their local DC. So you're talking a lot of money is wrapped up in the infrastructure for the citywide.
The thing with the citywide DCs is that they are quite high now, but it's a relatively recent phenomenon. They actually were very low for a very long period of time because not a lot of infrastructure was being collected through those. So it's probably doesn't look as bad as if you were just looking at what today's charge was. And I think, well, it was only $5,000 in the past. We must have a massive under collection, and that's just because of the change in the way we've used those, not because of under collections.
The water and wastewater charges are predominantly for Waiari, which is relatively new, and those recent upgrades at Tamana. So that's a relatively recent electricity won't be much better than
Steve?
Yeah, I think obviously DC's development agreements are one way we can try and capture the cost of growth. But one thing we haven't looked at is the ability to build targeted based on all lands, what that would look like. Would it be on a hectare basis? Would it be on a 1,000 square metre basis? What would it look like? So for example, you've got Tumu there. We've talked about how already ratepayers are picking up the tab for debt for something that's maybe not going to happen for another 10 years. They can still capture the return from Tumu by applying a token rate upon that land. And there's a wide amount of discretion that would be to go away the Supreme Court ruling, High Court ruling. There's a wide amount of discretion what you can charge token rate for. You can say, okay, out here in this Greenville area, we've had years of discussions with developers out there who have given their indication of willingness to want to develop. Well, okay, put a targeted rate there, we can put a differential on it.
There's a lot of vulnerable land out there.
How do we get on with every things that,
Land there, so.
But also it's not rateable if it's multiple owned multi-land.
like I'm just saying, it's a tricky,
Not to land.
how are the other people going to feel in the subdivision actually happens, like. Equities,
Well, I don't think there's such a thing as equity in business.
Well, I think that it's the same question. That's another way of value capture, basically. So, but yeah, I think that's something we definitely need to look at further and figure out. Because this is the risk I think we have is with the government saying we're going to value capture. Well, who's going to value capture? I think it's going to be central government, and that doesn't help us at all.
It's lots of money land, the little bit is yourselves, so current the council, so that goes around the circle, and that we won't look at three, so that you could.
It goes around in the circle until it's one time native.
So,
Continue to go around the circle.
yeah, so you.
We're conscious of time.
Just one quick question before we go. As you know, when you do the original assessments and come up with your numbers for it all, it factors in like CPI or some form of
Cost of
I
capital.
mean, so are we historically underestimating that? I mean, is that an area where we can make adjustments anyway? Because you can't do CPI as you're going, but in your initial calculations, is there a benefit to us to be a bit more bold there?
It comes down to what we can do and what we can challenge on. We do it, but we didn't, for example, forecast the supply chain disruption through COVID, which was a much bigger, a much higher number. So,
I think legally, the development contribution policy must align with your long-term plan, and the long-term plan inflation assumptions are audited and need to be evidenced by external projected experts on what the inflation levels are likely to be. So that's why you can't have a different inflation assumption in your LTP from what you're putting into your development.
You can build contingencies into your project cost estimate, which is what we do, and we review our policy annually. So we look at, all the projects and update the cost estimates of those. It's an ongoing process to get it as good as possible. The next slide here is on development agreements, just so you know what's going on in there. For the first one, we have a development agreement in place with the developer of the Waihaki Town Centre, so the Blue Haven Group. Its value is around $50 million of infrastructure being delivered through that agreement, which we're funding a portion related to Tumu, which is roughly about 30% of the cost of some roads and pipes and stuff like that through the town centre. Turika West, we're negotiating a developer agreement there for the internal infrastructure, so the key collector roads, big pump stations, truck water pipes, etc., big stormwater system, and the value of around $200 million. That's $200 million that if you rolled back, we use a traditional approach like we do in FM or Papamoa, would sit on your balance sheet, be funded through DCs. The Tumu, scale of that is much larger. And so that $700 million includes over $400 million of roads, and that's what we talked before going. It's pretty expensive and is challenging for the development overall financially. So we're reviewing some of that, but regardless, it's still going to be a big number. That's the internal infrastructure. So not the stuff that's not in our LTP. It's just the internal infrastructure that we expect the developer to deliver. We're not in the process of negotiating how that will look yet. The landowners want to move some other parts of the project forward further before they start to think about funding, financing, those sorts of things. And then we've got a smaller agreement in place with Ohaueri. I think we might have also missed the Taraka Business Estate off there, which I mentioned before. But yeah, we've got a couple of smaller ones as well that we are negotiating. So I think we've talked about most issues around this. I think the key point, the last two bullet points are really key. One is that this is transferring responsibility for design and construction of big assets that are going to end up as council assets to the development community. Things that council traditionally would have done will be done by others, and so we just need to make sure that that process is robust and we end up with the right asset. And that as design happens, the right people in our organisation from our infrastructure group are involved, and that consideration is not given to just how do we minimise the cost of what we're building, but how do we make sure that's not at the expense of massive ongoing operational costs. There's a balance there. And then the last point is all about when you can and can't do that. So in these big growth areas, there's typically 1, 2, 3 developers. So that works. That's a small number of people to negotiate with and try and work together. When you get to other growth areas like Keenan Road, where there's like over 80 landowners, it becomes effectively impossible to take this approach. And TCC will need to take a role of coordinating the delivery of infrastructure and taking a more standard approach to the use of development contributions. Which is, I guess, one of the reasons why we preferred Taraka West to proceed ahead of Keenan Road, because we didn't have the financial means to deliver that for Keenan Road at this time. The next slide deals with the government funding reforms. So there's a heap happening in this space at the moment. So you've got talked about the reform around development contributions. They're also reviewing the infrastructure funding and financing legislation to see if they can make that more workable. They're looking at value capture and GST sharing is a possibility. It's coming up through there. It could be quite a game changer, but that would be a big step for the government to take. There's a lot happening in transport, as you know, with the TNL tolling submission. So there's a lot happening with tolling, congestion charging, user charges, etc. City regional guilds, you know, thinking about that, a big push towards public-private partnerships and bringing more money into the system, more from a financing perspective that way. And then the local government, local water, done well, which will, as we talked today already, will have some implications around funding and the levels around where things sit from a funding perspective. While there's a lot happening, it's uncertain about just, you know, collectively how far these reforms will go in terms of addressing the challenges we've got. And I guess it's the risk that, you know, that they don't necessarily go far enough to fully address the funding challenges that we have. And even if they do, it's going to mean that the same people we have in our community, whether they are, you know, ratepayers or whether they are developers or landowners, they're going to have to pay a lot more because we have a lot more infrastructure to deliver. So there's that this affordability element to consider at some point on case by case basis through various projects. So just moving on to development feasibility. Yeah, so we've talked about this quite a bit, and the reality is that we've got a private sector-led development market, right? So if the private sector can't make money, then houses and new commercial buildings and stuff like that don't get built because the public sector delivers very little in that space. So development feasibility is all about looking at what does it cost to develop, what are the revenues you get from development, what's the profit margin or loss, and is that sufficient to, to get someone out of bed to do that, to get the bank to say, yeah, I'm okay to finance your project, etc. I guess the first thing is feasibility, sort of not static. It's massively responsive to a wide range of factors, including the economic and property market. It's been significantly affected by cost changes coming out of COVID. There was a point in time during the GFC where the Waiaki urban growth area was not feasible and very little of any development was happening. But you go through it now, there are many thousands of houses there. So things do change, but it's a really important thing to get right if council is going to invest money. You don't want to invest big money in infrastructure for a project that's not feasible. So it's highly important that work for those decisions. And now it's just a core part of our kind of urban planning sort of approach. And we've got some internal kind of capability, but we also do rely on some external input into that as well. People have really got their ear to the ground in terms of development costs and that sort of thing. So the next slide is a slide on greenfield and one on intensification. And like I said before, from a greenfield perspective, feasibility is pretty finely balanced at the moment. Costs have gone through the roof, particularly around infrastructure, and obviously things have been challenged around section prices. Probably not a lot of section price growth, value growth, and for a number of years. So the highest cost items, and it's hard to see the table, but it's just an example of one of the large scale projects that we're working through at the moment. I've sort of removed some of the details so you can't tell which growth area it is. It's sort of sensitive when we work that through with landowners, etc., and developers. But you can see, and if you have a good look, that you've got sort of land cost, which is your raw land cost, so what you buy the land for, or you bought the land for to develop, coming in at just under 10%. You're losing a huge amount of land to constraints. So while you might have to buy a whole farm, you can only develop half of that farm. So this things to be set aside for various reasons. Your bulk earthworks are often a very large cost. In this instance, they're relatively low because the land's relatively flat. In other instances, they could be, 15-20% of your cost. Civil works, which are your vested assets, so building all your subdivision roads and stuff like that, that comes through this example is where probably the largest cost sits. And then you've got your internal bulk infrastructure, which we talked about before, where we're requiring the developers to deliver. So I think on this one, you've got enabling infrastructure and trunk roads. That's 36% of your development costs. Trunk water, another 7%. So that takes you to 43, and then your local subdivision infrastructure is at 18. So that takes you to like 60% of your development costs is in earthworks and infrastructure.
That's a bit sad, we're not making money.
Well, yeah, I guess, but it's all about providing housing for the community.
That's right.
Yeah. And what those house prices will be. And then you've got, obviously, they're going to pay the external infrastructure costs, DCs or other things as well. So these costs are driving what you see in the real world, which is the fact that we've got high section prices. Section prices have to be high for sections to be delivered. No one's going to build a section and lose money on it. It's driving those high house prices, and it's driving different behaviours, and the fact that people are going, well, we can't now deliver a 700 square metre section because it's not a very good efficient use of the land. Now we're delivering 200 square metre sections.
The other thing is that the time frames taking greenfield, they buy the land, but the interest costs they're accumulating, and the longer it's taking, you can see how long it's taking. I spoke to Terry that just keeps getting added into the cost equation, and so the uncertainty, particularly around the RMA, the delays of that uses.
So 2 more slides on the section better race through because we're running out of time. So if you look at intensification, feasibility is driven by different factors, and feasibility across the city is quite different, like feasibility in a high value area. Like say Mount Bethlehem is quite different to a low value area like a Maryvale Gate Pass, something like that, because people are willing to pay quite different prices for the same thing in those areas. But largely your actual cost, aside from the land component, which again is a small component, is pretty much fixed. Like if you're building an apartment building in parts of the city, you might spec it a little bit differently, but largely the cost of actually delivering is the same everywhere. The smaller kind of scale typologies are a lot more feasible than the big stuff. So terraces and duplexes are way more feasible than apartments. They are cheaper to build per square metre, and they are far less risky because you might only have to sell 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 dwellings, not 20 or 30 or 30 to make your project work. And for most projects, you need to pre-sell, particularly for apartment building. And then through COVID, there were major issues with apartment projects. They could pre-sell, well, they did, and then prices went up, construction costs went up, and so they lost all their pre-sales when they went back to those purchasers and said, "Oh, can you pay another $200,000 for your apartment?" A lot of them just the way as you can imagine. So, what drives the additional kind of construction costs around intensifications that you're going upwards and you're moving? So, going upwards brings in a lot of cost, and in particularly as you move beyond 3 stories, you're moving into concrete, steel, you're moving into brick shafts, you're moving into some real technical design stuff around fire, for instance, fire protection. And you've got a lot of costs going down in terms of foundations and things like that. So from an apartment building perspective, the construction cost piece is about $6,000 to $8,000 a square metre, but your overall development cost is around $13,000 a square metre, which gets you to costs of $700,000 to $800,000 for 50 and 60 square metre apartments. And it's pretty consistent with the small amount of apartments you do see out there at that sort of level. So moving forward, we've done a lot of work around feasibility, and that goes into our projections of how much intensification we think we're going to see over the next wee while, and it's certainly an increasing level, but mainly at that smaller scale, kind of terrace housing type level, very few apartments that we've put in 10 years, and you can just see on that slide some of the broader challenges around intensification as well, about finding appropriate sites around dealing with some of the flood risks that exist. Parkway and other parts of the infill area, dealing with covenants in some of the newer areas for the development, and the ultimate customer demand side, which is still a limited kind of market for that sort of product. So one more slide, and then we'll break for further questions, and that's sort of what are we doing and what are our key work streams in the growth funding space over the next 12 months. So certainly reviewing the DCL policy, working on those developer agreements, working and trying to advocate into that government reform process. Possibly some stuff around the specified development project for the Western Corridor that gets approved by the Minister, but there's uncertainties there. It's like it might take a while, and continuing to work on feasibility of it. So we can break for some questions, and then we've got two final slides on the OpEx side of things.
And that would take one for yellow. I'm just saying.
Well, Paul went through his other slides pretty quick, so maybe not long. You're going to do the OpEx now?
Okay, is that me? Thank you.
Yeah.
I'm just saying, do we need a break? Short 5-minute break for toilet break, or we put through to the finish? Right, okay, we'll adjourn for 5 minutes.
Yeah.
Three storms. whole unit time and instead of. That's really moving. That isn't what it means. That's what I mean. As soon as you get over that, it's time.
Understand that you take development.
Again.
We're back on.
Okay, we'll hand over to Paul for the master.
So just in terms of OPEX, it's probably something that gets often overlooked in the growth space is that it's the same dilemma occurs as the cost on the capital side. We hold a lot of debt for a long period while that growth takes place. We also incur the cost of OPEX from, as soon as the infrastructure goes in, but we don't have the rate base increase to cover it for years into the future. So that is one of the funding dilemmas that we continue to work through effectively. Also, there is actually which is why we try to infrastructure to align to when growth comes in the best as possible to be able to do it. But unfortunately, we can't deliver infrastructure that aligns with the cost of with population increase to minimise that because of the nature of bulk infrastructure. So that's probably without going, I don't want to go through the detail and every bit on that, but that's probably the key thing that comes through this is that whether it be we spoke about it earlier that with vested assets still include OPEX costs going forward, which are included. So the cost of those will flow through into our rates each year. That's probably the questions on that because that's the fundamental message on OPEX is that it incurs a cost without the population growth increase to support it, which is effectively going across our existing rate infrastructure.
There's a couple other kind of implements in there, I think. One was about the fact that you're going to get more operating costs, but you also, in time, then you get your revenue. So, you've got to consider both sides of that equation.
Yeah, the timing of it is the key.
Yeah. And I guess the other point more coming through the points at the bottom was in this one. Oh yeah, the key one was probably a couple. One is about whether some areas will have higher infrastructure costs than others, but the work we've done today shows we need to grow all of those identified growth areas to meet your population urban growth needs. So it's about, do we really have real choices? I mean, if we want to address, the population growth that we do have. And the second one was about also thinking about some of the broader implications. Like, for example, we could do things to say in high cost areas, we're not willing to invest there because rates will go up. But if that has a corresponding effect of pushing overall house prices and rents up across Tauranga, you might save everyone $10 a week in rates, but cause them a $50 or $100 more on their mortgage or their rent. So, people might be worse off. So there's a bigger picture than just the TCC rates, and focusing on that, we should focus on, I guess, the broader community costs and the big parts of their budgets.
So have we got actual numbers or percentages on the growth related OPEX that does end up in our rates?
Well, they are incorporated in that general plan. We have the breakdown.
It's next slide.
It's just going to do.
Oh, it doesn't have to go there, but it talks about whether we should do that.
Yeah.
But is it something we can say that overall there's a 20% of the rates that residents in Tauranga pay is for growth?
Yeah, we can do some approximate measurements of those.
It just means that there's a number, but like the Rainbow Project was 5 cents per ratepayer or something. It's like people like numbers or want the numbers.
We can certainly do it. I think the other thing that I would say is we don't not all costs automatically will. Like, for example, a maintenance cost may be able to be incorporated in a maintenance contract, so there might not be a direct correlation because we can incorporate additional.
I'm not going down to that level, but it would just be good to know what chunk of money we're talking about. And if we're talking about rate increases of 15%, and 3% of that increase is.
So we can do that based on the level. Like, we look at the level of growth related capital expenditure. That obviously it doesn't include an interest cost because that's included in the contribution charge, but it does include the depreciation charge coming through, it does include the other maintenance costs, so that we can give you what that would look like in terms of the portion of, based on that level of capital spend, what the rates contribution for that year is.
And do commercial, and this is just residential, commercial rates at the same?
No, it's both.
Right.
Yes, we can give it to you at both levels.
The other point on this slide is just addressing that issue around intensification, and while the infrastructure is in the ground in our existing suburbs, that infrastructure does not have infinite potential to accommodate intensification, and in fact our current LTP has a huge amount of investment in intensification areas to accommodate more growth. And yeah, if we were to deliver higher levels of intensification, it would correspond to much higher levels of investment needed. A lot of your local network, you will find, will have some pinch points and capacity issues, pump stations, pipe sizes. There's a lot of additional investment would probably need to go into resolving flooding issues, stormwater investment. So, and the cost of building infrastructure, rebuilding infrastructure, and these brownfield existing suburbs can be very high because you're digging up hard surfaces and creating issues to manage with the existing communities that are kind of moving through there every day, etc.
So just immediately right, so what you just said then. So like, do we have a structured approach to how you go about that? Like if you say that you're going to do between 11th Ave and 17th Ave to get it up to speed to do this stuff, or is it like a piecemeal?
Yeah, so that, I mean, going into the LTP, we've worked on our overall level of growth and the allocation of growth versus various in various parts of the city. The various teams have done modelling to show, okay, so this is where the issues we think are going to be experienced in the network, and identified projects which have been included, in some cases not included in the LTP. So we've got a reasonable handle at a more bulk level of where the issues are. It's the local kind of network stuff and the street by street that is a little bit harder to determine, because you don't know exactly where the development will pop up. Is it in 17th Ave or 14th Ave, that kind of thing. So some of it has to be a little bit reactive.
And also the view that there is some capacity in existing networks for notification, and because the council had limited balance sheet, we said, well, the developers need to find opportunities where there is capacity. But we know that if you want to deliver everything in terms of buffer intensification, there'll be a point where you have to put some more capacity in. But we said, well, there's enough there, and we also know that the market uptake is going to be relatively low given all those other points. So you don't want to overinvest too early from that same point, and we felt now it's not the right time, other than some quite specific infrastructure that was flexible. A lot of it has been sitting there. Yeah.
So the
Just a time here. We have one more question from Glenn. Is there any other questions urgent from? Yes, one more question, quick wrap up.
Yeah, there's probably more related to the previous slide that just trying to understand the question. Your question related to the overall scope of growth. There's a whole lot of stuff you've got there which is not factored in. But one thing that the mayor had said in Smart Growth was, could there be realistically, it was at the Smart Growth workshop in September, was, can there be a net present value calculation of the OPEX and the operational revenue related to growth for the next, I think he said 50 or 100 years, I don't know if anyone recalls was there. Like, is that something you can actually, because what I think he was looking for, having talked to him about it, is to go, if you take everything into account and you put it into OPEX terms, which is what the average person in the streets going to be impacted by, what are we actually talking about all up? So it sort of extends the Deputy Mayor's question even further to where you say that with a comprehensive picture for, say, Tauriko West, which will have DCs as well as a developer agreement. You know, I realise smaller DCs, but you know, then there'll be OPEX stuff that is included, OPEX stuff that isn't included. There'll be operational revenue, which will come in. There could be targeted rates. There'll be all sorts. But I realise it's complex, but is what the mayor talking about theoretically possible to get, where you could actually have some numbers, obviously rounded, how and think, to give us an idea of which areas will, in the long term, get the best value and results.
Theoretically, there would be cash flows available that could be forecast, which means there would be NPVs that theoretically could be calculated. Obviously, the accuracy of them is,
I think what I recall, I think Martin was there as well. I think what Mahe was looking at was that we have, and I'll pick one example. I don't know if this is the mayor's example, but you have something like Kenan Road, which is pretty challenging probably to get across cost effectively. You might get 2,000 dwellings, and you look at the bang for buck for that. I think what he's driving at is to get the most optimal bang for buck. Certainly that's what I'm driving at, to kind of go, yes, we need to deliver every growth area and intensification to meet our smart growth strategy and to meet the government's goals. But fundamentally, this is about the people of Tauranga. And if we're actually investing hundreds and hundreds of millions, billions potentially into particular areas for growth, if the return on investment is bad and the externalities of it, which we're talking things like time lost through congestion, the fact we haven't got connecting Mount Wanganui on the books, that's largely needed due to growth. It's not allocated into as I understand it, into DCs or anything like that because it hasn't got onto the books. So, you know, there are a lot of things about growth that we aren't even factoring in, but fundamentally it's to say, is this a good return on investment? Just like a business case, you say, you know, if you build something, basically if you're building a whole suburb with a whole lot of people moving here to Tauranga, what are we talking about in financial terms?
I think, and Andy or Fraser can jump in, but theoretically, the return on investment from a council perspective, if you take into account that we charge cost of capital on DCs, you would end up with an NPV close to zero if you had no under collection effectively through that period, subject to the OPEX implication.
Yeah,
the question then becomes effectively is what you're actually delivering in terms of housing in the city, effectively, which makes it a more complex. Well, you would have to think about how.
Just sort of putting it as a think piece thing. Seeing that was the first thing I think the mayor raised in his first workshop at Smart Growth. So I think it's something we could ponder on.
Well, if there's no more questions, I'd like to thank Christine, Amy, Paul, and all the staff here this morning for all their great work and contributions. And I found it very informative. I think we've still got more questions and more will come in time. Just write them all down and save them up for the next one. With that, I would like to bring Monday's Vision Planning Growth Environment meeting to an end. Thank everyone for your patience. I've enjoyed it. And for the next one, thank you, everybody. The meeting is now closed. It's 10.
Thanks, Matt.
Yeah.
You got it all?
But there's another meeting. Yeah.
The rush one.
Yeah.
What is it?
Allows.
It's actually. Yeah.
Right.